Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations.
Since Vatican II, the Church has engaged in dialogue with the world to the point of worldliness. But it's clear that the popes and the better bishops of the past 70 years of this process have at least attempted to walk a fine line between the gospel and worldliness. You get the hermeneutic of continuity here. Because people who've read a lot of preconciliar documents, preconciliar papal statements, preconciliar theological manuals, and the manuals that came after Vatican II can see that something happened where things changed dramatically. And Cardinal Ratzinger, future Benedict XVI, and others developed the concept of the hermeneutic of continuity to try to bridge the gap, because the alternative was rupture. And rupture was offered as the counterargument by two figures, or two factions in the Church. Sedevacantists on one side, and what we now call the hypermodernists, the Bergoglians, on the other. It was Ratzinger's project to defeat that argument entirely, that it was the same Church, and anything after Vatican II had to be understood and implemented in light of the theology before the Church, before Vatican II. Because if you don't do it that way, then rupture is the only option, and you've got a real problem on your hands. Well, one of the outcomes of all this was worldliness. But the fine line of trying to balance the two through that hermeneutic of continuity disappeared under Francis. He actually abolished the concept of the hermeneutic of continuity, not explicitly, but in some of his documents after Traditionis Custodes, they talked about how various interpretations of Vatican II documents and their implementation were no longer allowed, and the hermeneutic of continuity was one of them. The focus in the post-conciliar Church has become worldly. If you object, you're called rigid, you're called hopeless, and accused of turning inward away from a world that needs joy. The gospel has become synonymous with joy. And while it's certainly true that you could find saints talking about the joy of the gospel, you could be forgiven for thinking that means the Vatican just promotes feeling good and happiness instead of the hard demands the gospel makes of us. The saints found joy in their suffering, a concept that we can't even wrap our head around anymore, unless you've experienced it. The modern world, joy and suffering are antonyms. They're not synonyms. They're opposites. You cannot put them together. But the classic gospel message of the Church has always been we can find joy in our suffering. And now that's just been replaced with joy, good tidings, getting along, universal human fraternity. And there's one man who is the embodiment of this besides Francis, and that is Cardinal Zuppi. He's the sort of de facto head of the bishops of Italy, and he is one of the front runners to be the next pope. He's a Bergoglian through and through, though he is more tolerant of the traditional mass, the preconciliar form of the mass that they're trying to get rid of entirely, as well as the traditional breviary and devotionals than Francis is. But he is a Bergoglian through and through, and boy, does this man have some words for you today. Coming to you from Catholic Culture under the headline, Italian Synodal Assembly Day 1. Dialogue with the world is essential, says Cardinal Zuppi. You want to know what the essence of real dialogue with the world is? Authentic dialogue with the world. It's the preaching of the gospel. If you want to go back to that Carlo Acutis story covered earlier, the one really good thing about him being canonized is that it is bringing attention to people who may not consider the gospel until they see a kid who looks like them, had interests like them that they can relate to. And maybe that's all the defense for his canonization that's needed. But in this story, with Cardinal Zuppi, he's not talking about dialogue with the world for the conversion of the world. The Bergoglian, post-conciliar, nonsensical approach to dialogue is, and has been for 60 years, and increasingly getting worse, is the Church stepping back from moral proclamations, from reminding people of the world of the prices of sin. What is the wage of sin? It's death. This world is steeped in sin, and it gets worse as time goes on. We are told that things that were completely unfathomable are now not only be not objected to, but they're actually normal. And you're kind of weird if you oppose to two dudes getting a kid off the internet, paying some lady to have a kid. You're a bad person if you object to that. objecting to any of this is rigidity of the worst kind. Let's go to the article. Quote, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi of Bologna, the president of the Italian Episcopal Conference, delivered the opening address at the church in Italy's Second Synodal Assembly, which is taking place at the Vatican in the Paul VI Audience Hall from March 31st to April 3rd. The Synodal Assembly, whose theme is May Our Joy Be Full, has more than 1,000 participants, including 442 laity, 229 of whom are women. The first Synodal Assembly took place in Rome last November at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. The Second Synodal Assembly is expected to approve propositions that will be sent to the Italian bishops for their consideration. St. John's words, May our joy be full, quote, quoting Zuppi now, introduce us to that house where the Father throws his arms around our necks and kisses us, freeing us from my condemnation, because in that house everything that is mine is yours, said Cardinal Zuppi. Our thoughts immediately go to Pope Francis, who has made Gaudium, joy, the hallmark of his ministry, to free us from a sad Christianity, closed in on itself, reduced to reassuring, restless for the interior and not for the world, obsessed defender of its own fears that it mistakes for truth because it has lost the sense of history, becoming a purist judge, an active Pelagian who trusts his works, or a Gnostic in love with his own reasoning or interpretations. End quote. Come back to him in a moment. This should not surprise you at all. He is the front runner, and he sounds like a more articulate Pope Francis. And just like Francis, remember when Francis was first really introduced to the world, other than those weird pictures from the loggia, but right afterwards, everybody commented on he seemed like a kindly grandfather figure, always smiling, always being, just his air about him was grandfatherly. Zuppi has that too, by the way. He's got that same weird charisma that makes Francis so potent, that makes people easy to ignore the weird stuff Francis does. That is what you face if Zuppi becomes your pope. He continues saying, quote, after making these criticisms, Cardinal Zuppi said that it is easy to end up being discontented, hypercritical of others, and not very capable of rejoicing in so much holiness of the next door, in search of a virtual community which does not exist, instead of humbling ourselves a little to build relationships, concrete and true bonds. The synodal journey has been, and is a fundamentally spiritual journey, a propitious opportunity to renew the bond between the Church and her risen Lord, a way to read the signs of the times, to expand the heart in faith, hope, and charity, to build community in the Church of God. He said at the conclusion of the first portion of his address, as he called on synodal participants to be builders of communities, of relationships, of families where one is generated to life and rebuilds the we of the Father's house, otherwise armored by the wounded resentment of the elder brother who has no interest in fraternity. Turning to joy, Cardinal Zuppi said that the Christian joy that the synodal path has concretely illustrated to us is communitarian. Don't confuse the word communitarian with communist. It's not the same thing. Ecclesial, not for the elite of the church, but finally in the plural and for everyone. Citing Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council's pastoral constitution of the church in the modern world, Cardinal Zuppi said that, quote, the council illustrated a fundamental characteristic of the Catholic Church, the positive attitude to dialogue with the world, frank, serene, mature, proactive, and if necessary, critical, always bold in defending the Lord and the person. This dialogue is essential. In fact, there's no Christian joy without a full insertion into history, without active involvement in people's affairs, without reading the signs of the times, without love for all, especially for those who find themselves relegated, in spite of themselves, to the existential peripheries. The passion to communicate the joy and hope of the gospel is united with the awareness of no longer separating one's own salvation from that of others, he continued. And that's true. That statement is true. Compassion is not separating oneself from the history of the world, of women and men, small, of the poor, broader, but sharing it interiorly and in deeds. Now our joy is truly full, not because we have all the answers, because we are walking after Jesus, perhaps poor, but closer to each other and to our fellow travelers. End quote. Not because we have all the answers, he says. I'm sorry to be the one to break this to you, but the Catholic Church has all the spiritual answers. It does. That's not triumphalist. In fact, it comes with a rather heady and heavy responsibility and consequences if you don't live up to that responsibility. But they sell error with truthful statements, and they always have. If he steps out on the loggia, then my words to you will be, meet the new Pope, same as the old. That's Cardinal Zuppi. The synodal path is lifting things up. And the ones who are the biggest threat to this are those afraid, fearful people who think that they have all the answers, this sad Christianity. That's what he's calling traditional Catholicism. The preconciliar form of the faith that is making a remarkable comeback right now. Can't be blind to it. It's happening on shockingly large scale, despite the fact that they've done everything in their power to make it impossible for people. Get ready, folks. Get ready. I'm curious what you have to say about this. So let me know in the comments, please. Are you that surprised by Cardinal Zuppi sounding like that? Does this make sense in light of recent stories going after the church on canonizations and things? That what he's preaching to you is a feel-good message. The error he makes there, it's a very obvious one. The church very rarely speaks anymore about correcting evils in the world. They've done it on a few things, and that's a good start. But there's a lot more that they could speak on. But they don't, unless it affects their bottom line. Because the modernists have allied themselves with the worst elements of the secular world, ideologically speaking. Zuppi will not change that. But I am curious what you have to say about all this, so let me know in the comments, please. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So does sharing this on social media. That does help too. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.